Welcome to this edition of the Capital Brief. I'm Seth Berenzweig here in our BL Media studio in beautiful downtown Tysons, Virginia. Back again with our friend and colleague John Tamny from RealClear Markets. John, how are you?
I'm great.
Excellent, excellent. So we're here today to talk about the highest profile corporate fraud case pending in the country. If not the highest profile corporate fraud case that's been in the United States for many years, and it's the Elizabeth Holmes Theranos trial. Just to very quickly set the stage, Elizabeth Holmes, who was the principal and CEO of Theranos, is being accused of about 11 counts of corporate fraud, specifically wire fraud and conspiracy to engage in a allegedly fraudulent scheme to bring in what amounted to be about $800 million for something that allegedly she knew was a sham in terms of whether or not this machine that they were supposedly creating could display many different kinds of medical observations and conclusions based upon one or two drops of blood versus the usual full vial. It went belly up. A Wall Street Journal article in about 2015 allegedly exposed it. And as we speak, she's kind of fighting for her freedom in a trial in California. So tell me your observations on this trial. It's been going on for several weeks. The prosecution called 29 witnesses. This is one of the highest profile cases going on in corporate America. What are your thoughts and observations on the case as it stands?
I think it's a tragedy that someone who allegedly failed in a business sense is fighting for her freedom. It takes me back to the story of the Wright brothers. They're down in Kitty Hawk. These are bike shop owners who see a path to flight. And to be clear, the Washington Post editorialized in the late 1800s that man would never fly. This was an impossibility. And you have these two brothers down in Kitty Hawk watching birds trying to imitate how they flap their wings, and they're laughed at. Wait, these guys think that man can fly? They were a joke. And it's just...
Their first attempts were a complete disaster.
A total disaster.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder that the rare, the creative, the people who see a different future and try to rush it into the present are the people who vastly improve life. And yet here we are. Again, I will only say allegedly Elizabeth Holmes failed,
Right.
and she is fighting for her life, and she's fighting for it because she succeeded in having a vision and finding investors willing to back that vision, and that allegedly is an imprisoning offense. Very scary to me.
Well, you've mentioned what part of the defense theory is, which is, not being able to succeed in your startup isn't a felony, and in fact, it happens all the time. Love the reference to the Wright brothers. The Wright brothers actually tried to, in the interest of patriotism, have their technology provided to the United States government, and they passed because they just said it'll never work. So they ended up working with France. But coming back to the modern time, the allegations include some very specific evidence. And I've gone through the prosecution's case, and we don't have time to go through 29 witnesses of testimony, but allow me to kind of push back a little bit on your theory by sharing two highlights of evidence. Allegedly, in 2010, a lab director by the name of Tyler Schultz went into her office, the former lab director, and told her that the machine just simply did not work. That was about 2.5 years before it was commercially launched, and her reaction was one of great nervousness and being very upset. He was not the only person from the lab to tell her in that building that it didn't work, but allegedly she continued to press ahead. About a year later, or actually, forgive me, around the same time frame, there was an alleged joint Theranos-Pfizer memo that was sent out to potential investors, which seemed to indicate that Pfizer was behind the technology, and that therefore, since they were aligned on the effectiveness of the machine with Theranos, that others should jump in, despite the fact that several months beforehand, Pfizer had actually communicated to Theranos that they didn't believe that the machine worked and that they were not interested. And the prosecution's made a lot of hay about that. So, listen, if you're going to get 29 witnesses on the stand, you're going to be able to find a couple of nuggets that are going to be a little bit compelling. So those are some of the highlights, though. But what is it that you've seen in this trial that troubles you the most, that leads you to feel that this has basically just morphed into an unfair prosecution?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to hit on the Tyler Schultz thing as a way of getting to that. Mm-hmm. It cannot be stressed enough that the definition of an entrepreneur is someone who believes deeply in something that is broadly rejected. Because, see, if it was already believed in, if it were thought possible, it would already be a product. And so almost as a rule, they're trying to develop something that people have maybe thought, okay, it can't happen. And so that's the first thing. It's no surprise that she would have employees who would question her vision. When has that ever not been true? To be a CEO, particularly of a startup, you have to be so deep in your belief because, again, you're trying to do something that's broadly rejected. It is seen as impossible. So it doesn't surprise me. You can always, with thousands of employees, find a few who thought, hey, wait, this doesn't work. But even to read the book, what has to be acknowledged in the book, what's it called? It's slipping my mind right now, but I read it closely and took careful notes.
It was a book about her...
Carrie Rue, yeah. And
Yeah.
so I'm trying to think the blood something, but...
it's been getting a lot of media attention.
And so
lately.
this was what brought it all on.
Blood money or
Blood
something
money.
of that nature.
They
yeah.
kept stressing in the book that she had people testing the machine over and over again. It's not as though she didn't recognize that the Edison had weaknesses. That's a given.
The Edison being the name of the machine.
The name of the machine.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, she knew that. And so she kept testing it over again. Let's see what's wrong and keep trying to get to a point of fixing it. Mm-hmm. After which, let's recognize a basic truth here. In Silicon Valley, no less than 90% of startups fail. You think when someone comes into your office, when you've been fighting for your very existence for years, you think that what got you to that point of raising all this money might have you believing differently from some employee who says, all that you've worked for doesn't work. If she were just going to give in at that point and say, oh, yeah, no, you're right, let's just fold up shop, she would never have been in this position in the first place. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Startup CEOs are made of a different metal, and so for us to judge them based on how we think or how we live is unfair. Mm-hmm. They're doing something that the vast majority of people could never do and wouldn't have the courage to do.
It's funny. I find this case to really be emblematic of serving as a filter of ourselves. And what I mean by that is when she, pre-Wall Street Journal article, which came out in 2015 or 2016, was out there on Fortune magazine holding the vial with her Steve Jobs-like black sweater. She was really the darling of Silicon Valley, and there was a rush to judgment to say that she's great. And then afterwards, and there were regulatory investigations in 2018 and 2019 that led to the prosecution, now there's a rush to judgment to say that she's terrible. And of course, that is emblematic of what happens in our society sometimes, because there are a lot of CEOs that succeed. There are a lot of CEOs that don't succeed. But it's been really interesting to see the continued bandwagon mentality of how the media and social media have been covering this trial. I'm a little bit more pessimistic on her defense. Although I agree with some of the points that you're saying. I mean, obviously, if the prosecution thinks that the jury's going to feel sorry for a bunch of billionaire knuckleheads that threw money in. I mean, if Betsy DeVos was silly enough to put $100 million into this without really understanding what was going on, then quite frankly, that's on her. And I don't think a jury's going to feel sorry for her. Talking about wishful thinking and just blindness moving forward, Walgreens was the main provider of the machine because for the commercialization to happen, they wanted to be able to have it through a delivery system that was efficient throughout the United States. So Theranos executed a teaming agreement with Walgreens. And then Walgreens later said, oh, shame on her, she duped us, and sued for a bunch of money. Well, Walgreens signed the partnership agreement with Theranos after one of the chief scientists for Walgreens came back after looking at the machine and told them that he didn't think it worked and that they should not have the partnership. But they did it anyway because they felt that it was a great story and that it was exciting and they wanted it to work and they thought it would be an amazing story for the company and the stock price and all the rest of it. So you have some of the most sophisticated people and some of the most sophisticated advanced corporations on the planet that are following along with her. It's hard for me to imagine how a jury's going to feel sorry about that. What they will have some sympathy for are the patients, because there are patients that got incorrect results, and therefore that was a problem. So in light of everything that's been happening in the trial, and as we speak, she's being cross-examined by the prosecution. I know there's a crack in your crystal ball, but generally, where do you see this trial headed?
I think it's going to head in a direction that's going to be unsatisfying for everyone, because I think they're going to get into things unrelated to the business aspects of the trial in order to create sympathy for both sides. There's the argument, of course, that again, the machine didn't always work, or it didn't consistently work, so people got some false tests. Okay, well, we're living that right now with fast tests for COVID-19 that many say can kill us with great rapidity. Right. And so this wouldn't be the first time of that. That's not a reason to put someone in prison. The assumption, of course, what people can't seem to get their heads around is they keep saying, well, she did this fraudulently. She raised an enormous sum of money for something that she knew could not work.
Right.
Well, that's very interesting, because let's not forget something that we both know very well. The market for private company shares out in Silicon Valley is highly liquid. At one time, it's well known that Theranos was valued at $9 billion. If you and I had wanted to invest in Theranos, they would have laughed at us and said, get in a very long line. If Elizabeth Holmes had wanted to cash out a few billion, she very easily could. Instead, her family quite literally may face bankruptcy over this. She never sold a share.
Yeah.
In the company that she allegedly knew was fraudulent. And to me, that's all the information you need to know, that she never stopped believing in what she had, yet they're acting like she's a thief, that she should go to prison for saying something that wasn't true.
Right.
I find that offensive, and I also find it chilling for what it signals to the entrepreneurs of the future.
So she's facing 20 years. I think that some of aspects of her defense, which we won't spend a lot of time lingering on, are risky. Her COO, Sunny Balwani, is being portrayed as the fall guy. Part of her allegation is that he abused and manipulated her, and that she was basically under his thumb, despite the fact that you saw years of her being a very poised, powerful CEO in the media that was really strongly standing up for herself. And there are several years' worth of texts between her and Sunny that don't seem to bear out that portrayal. But who's to say how this is going to play out with a jury? I think that one of the points that you've raised, which is really interesting, that I haven't heard anybody mention, is that that's yet another reason to not feel sorry for the investors. Because first of all, they did no due diligence. They just said, like Walgreens, I'm in, and buyer beware. But secondly, just because you hold stock doesn't mean that you can't sell stock. Usually, if a corporation is relatively closely held and wants to control who, as an outsider, can invest, it doesn't mean that a founder can't sell their shares. There may just be a first right of purchase for the shareholders that are presently in the company. So it's unusual for someone to not be able to have an absolute restriction on selling those shares, which I think is further in support of your argument. One of the big problems flipping the other way is that there are people that got test results back that really threw them into a medical panic, and then it turned out that those results were very inaccurate. And while it's true that we have inaccurate test results that we're dealing with on a lot of fronts, I think that's going to engender some jury sympathy. Let me ask you this aspect of it. This is being portrayed as a litmus test in Silicon Valley as putting the whole culture of fake it till you make it on trial. And they're saying that that's a culture in Silicon Valley and elsewhere where people are going out and they're raising a ton of dough, and that is a business practice that's really in the limelight that could be on trial right now. What do you think about that?
If it's going to be on trial, again, how scary. Silicon Valley is not the richest region in the world because everything succeeds. It's the richest precisely because most everything out there fails. Failure is not a death sentence out there. It is the creation of knowledge. Have we reached the frontier of healthcare? Have we reached the frontier of testing of our health? Not even close. And so instead of wanting to imprison her, we should say, thank goodness you, because of your charisma, because of the story you tell, because of your idea, raised $800 million that got us further along in finding out more quickly about what's going on in the human body, and that's going to pay enormous dividends down the line. It's just worth stressing that Theranos didn't produce nothing. Ultimately, Fortress Investment came in and bought out its intellectual property for over, I think, around $100 million. There is real wealth that was produced here. And what's unfortunate about this is who knows what happens if government just stays out of it altogether. But see, government always gets to take a piece of successes in Silicon Valley, but it's also there to fine people and imprison people when things don't work out. And that's really scary because if they don't step in, if the Wall Street Journal's reporter, John Carreyrou, who's not there anymore, hadn't been pressuring the FDA to basically indict her, maybe does Theranos last longer? Maybe can they do another round of funding in pursuit of crucial information that enhances living conditions and all this? These are the things we'll never know.
Yeah, those are definitely unique points, and definitely should be part of the conversation. For those of us who take a little bit more of a skeptical view towards her as a defendant, I would still say that the government has very powerful tools in its toolbox to be able to deal with sloppy fundraising in a manner that is extremely strong and punitive without having to throw someone in prison. You can have a civil enforcement action, for example, with civil money penalties, and you can punish someone without taking away 2 decades of their liberty. Now, it's going to be up to the jury to decide whether or not she should go. And I think it's going to be a close call. It should be very interesting. I do think that she threw some very risky dice in trying to pin the blame on her COO, because that really is inconsistent with a lot of her conduct. And I think they're going to have a hard time getting over the fact that while the jury's not going to feel sorry for a bunch of clueless billionaires, they probably will feel sorry for the patients. But ultimately, let's not forget that a lot of us here in corporate America and in the media have very short memories. Chipotle had a real problem with poisoning, and people got very, very sick. And there were those that said people will never forget it. Well, 6 months later, their numbers on their quarterlies were fantastic, and maybe people forgave and forgot. I don't know. But the overall culture, if there's going to be any change, is probably going to be very temporary. So just as a closing question, do you think that there's any aspect or consequence of this extremely high-profile trial that's going to have any kind of an impact on corporate America in any regard, or are we just going to continue to see business as usual?
I think you hit on it. I think we're going to continue to see business as usual, thank goodness.
Yeah.
Look, let's imagine if there is no government here. Assuming she creates a business that's just a shell of nothing, that would affect her ability in the future, obviously, to raise money. So there was going to be a market enforcement no matter what. You just didn't need the government enforcement. But let's not forget with all this that it only looks great after the fact. Silicon Valley is littered with VCs that passed on Google, on Amazon, on Facebook. Why was Peter Thiel able to get a 10% of Facebook for $500,000? Because most people thought it was a really bad idea. Assuming the Wright brothers had been able to attract substantial funding from rich people way back then, odds are they were going to look stupid or, quote, clueless. And I know you don't think all these people are clueless. Oh, wait, you funded someone who thought that they could enable man to fly? Again, something only looks good after the fact. If
Right.
it were simple, we would all be in there in the first place, or the market would have already discovered it. And so I think it's important to stress that this is why we need people like Elizabeth Holmes. We need people who see the future as it is, or the present as it is, and say this is insufficient. And we are going to rush, or we are going to strive mightily to rush an all-new future into the present. Without these vital few, progress stops. And I think it's very dangerous when we try to criminalize failure, and we've done it too much. Michael Milken spent time in prison for reasons that will never be properly explained. And are we going to make this mistake again?
Well, the government, I believe that she's going to get convicted. She may not get convicted on all 11 or 12 counts. I think that her defense angle is not correct. And I think that the government does have an element of a strong case where I think that she probably is going to get convicted. However, that doesn't mean that the government shouldn't have considered other tools in their disposal to try to address some of this. There were many ways that the government could have come in with a different kind of sledgehammer as opposed to just throwing somebody in jail for 2 decades. And my last point is that I doubt there's going to be any long-term change in terms of the culture of the ABCs of corporate America. ABC always be closing. The brokers are going to want to go and push the deals because they get a piece of the action. The people who are selling want to close the deals because they want to be able to have an exit event. And until people really take the time in the M&A world to actually look at something and lift up the hood, this is just going to keep happening again and again. And you're going to have people who are investors, they're going to get screwed, they're going to play false victims, and then the government's going to come in with a sledgehammer as opposed to a scalpel. So we'll see where the trial goes, but John, thanks a lot for coming back.